director Dr. Amrita Panda to discuss on this topic. যারা নতুন তাদের জন্য জানাই যে আমার নাম প্রিয়াঙ্কা এবং আই এম a part of DeepRanjani Foundation. DeepRanjani Foundation is Section 8 company which has devoted its entire entity to serving the community of special needs. আমরা vocational rehabilitation নিয়ে কাজ করি. We are workstation based organization where we have 5 workstations where we train and educate and empower people with special needs to have and hold a job of their own. And along with that, we also provide skill training, behavior modification, mental health support, and everything else that can come up with it to help them sustain a vocation. And after today's session, we have a very interesting offering for all of you. So we would request you to be here till the end of us. And our speaker has joined. Hello, ma'am. Good evening. So we'll begin in a while. And yeah, so we can just take one more minute to see if other people are joining. And then I'll just share my screen and we can start.
Sure. Very good evening, everyone. Today we will be talking about an approach which is known as narrative approach or narrative therapy. And we will be talking about the impact or the use of narrative approach in the space of special needs. So it's like we will be trying to think from a perspective which is a little different from the way we look at our issues, our challenges, our adversities in our day-to-day life. So, Priyanka, can you please... So, talking about narrative therapy or narrative approach is a way of dealing with people or yourself, which is something very new in the therapeutic framework of our country. And if we consider, Jyoti Amra, okay. Yes. So if we consider the global presence of narrative therapy, it started some time back, and which has constantly gone through changes over time, over the years. And narrative therapy is a process, is an approach which is extremely personal, which is extremely individual centric, and which focuses more on the strengths of an individual. And the very core of narrative therapy says that our lives are made of stories. If we look closely towards our lives, we will see that we identify ourselves, we carry identities at times very unknowingly, which maps with the experiences of our lives, the events that we have been through, the impacts those experiences have made on us. And we tend to form our identity on the light of some specific stories of our life. For an example, if a person has gone through a lot of hardship in the family due to a medical illness from a very young age, the person identifies himself or herself as someone who's very sick and who is going through a life-altering medical challenge. So that becomes the person's identity. And the identity creates or weaves a story around that person that maps with that identity. And the story that the person develops with every single day, with every single passing experience, that kind of gets attached to that belief or to that identity that the person carries with himself or herself. So narrative is a a very person-centric a style and approach. Narrative is not just a therapeutic tool. It's not just a therapy modality. It's more a way of life, that a way through which, a lens through which a person looks at his or her own life. So the narrative therapy approach is basically where the therapist use this narrative lens and enables a client to find his or her own stories and how these stories has shaped up their identities in day-to-day life, and which has at times which focuses on particular aspects of life, and at times it takes a person away from different other possibilities, other stories that the person might have in his lifetime of experience. So through narrative approach, a person is basically empowering himself or herself and takes agency of their own life, embrace whatever they are expert with. And the emphasis of narrative therapy is on the stories of life, the way we have woven the stories. It's not just about the, when I say stories, it doesn't mean the incidents. It means the meaning that those incidents carried in our life, the meanings that we have given our life through those incidents or experiences. So narrative is basically an approach where we change, where we try to move towards a positive uh, approach, a positive narrative, a positive explanation of an individual life, taking away the negative approaches that may eventually impact the quality of life. Next slide, Priyanka. As I said, that when we go through certain incidents in our life, we tend to find meaning through these experiences in different ways. So if a person loses one of her parent at an early age, the person goes through an immense pain, an immense suffering, and a feeling of void, and a feeling of helplessness, and maybe the person may also feel directionless at that point of time. But it depends on the individual whether this particular incident impacts the person, stops the person's journey, or the person derives strength from this void, from this suffering, and moves ahead and writes his or her own narrative of life. So it's about the experience and the way we interpret those experiences, the way we derive meaning from this experience, and the way the meaning influence our identity and the identity that we represent to the world and to ourselves. So as I said, as I mentioned earlier, we can have multiple stories, and I believe we have numerous stories in our life at any given point that relates to us, to our abilities, to our strengths, to our failures, to our limitation, to our identity, to our self-esteem. And we tend to, some stories become predominant, and some stories, they tend to hide inside us. We do not give so much of importance to some stories, and we give a lot of importance to some of the stories. So the approach of narrative is focused on the way we redefine these stories, we remember these stories, we deconstruct these stories, and we make the positive stories a part of our day-to-day life and a part of our identity, a part of our self-esteem. So before I move forward, yeah, Priyanka, the earlier slide. No, the next one. Yes. So before we move forward, I would really like to listen from our participants. I cannot see them. So I would really like to know from our participants. I understand there are people who doesn't understand Bengali, but I believe most of the participants are Bengali here. So we can use any language, Bengali, Hindi, English, anything that you are comfortable with. If some of you can just unmute, you might switch on your video, you might not want to show your identity, you might just want to talk. So if you can take a moment and think, what are the predominant stories of your life that you have perceived as your identity, that you have believed to be your identity so far, wherever you are standing in your life at this moment? If any one of you can, would want to unmute and share.
May I?
Yeah, please.
Mona, whenever I talk about myself, my psychologist self becomes the predominant story of my life, I think. But 7-8 years from now, when I was younger, maybe the story that I am a person who was fat shamed throughout her life was more predominantly a story of my life. So,
Right.
just wanted to share.
Thank you for sharing, Priyanka. Anyone else? Just as in case of, as we are talking about special needs, just as in special needs, if there, I guess we also have parents here. In case of special needs, for the parents, particularly for the mothers, the identity of the person turns out to be mother of a special need child. And that is the dominant story that rules the person's life. I'm sure many of you will be able to identify yourself with this dominant discourse that having a child with autism or any disability turns out to be the focus identity of that person. And the dominant, predominant story of suffering, joy, ecstasy, and all such emotions there. Is there any parent who would like to share? Very good afternoon. Please, Bolun.
ম্যাম আগেও আমি আপনার প্রচুর সেমিনার আমি অ্যাটেন্ড করে এরকম এক্সপিরিয়েন্স আমি শেয়ার করেছি যে অ্যাজ এ স্পেশাল নিডস মাদার হিসেবে।
ওকে, আমরা এখান থেকে মুভ অন। হ্যাঁ, কেউ বোধহয় শেয়ার করতে চাইছেন।
ম্যাম আমার ক্যামেরা খুলছে না।
হ্যালো,
That's okay. That's okay. You can just switch on the audio.
ওয়াইফাইটা চলে গেছিল।
হ্যাঁ, বলুন।
আমার ওয়াইফাইটা অফ হয়ে গেছিল, সরি ম্যাম।
It's okay.
তো সেই ক্ষেত্রে ওনাদের যেটা বক্তব্য ছিল যে আমার উমটা ভালো নয়, আমি একজন ভালো মা নই, এবং ধাক্কা দিয়েছিল জীবনে এটাই যে ওনারা চেয়েছিলেন আমার আর আমার হাজবেন্ডের ডিভোর্স করিয়ে আমার হাজবেন্ডের সেকেন্ড ম্যারেজ করানো, এবং সেটার জন্য যার পর চেষ্টা করা হয়েছিল, ইভেন কি মানে আমাকে বাড়ি থেকে বের করে দেওয়া হয়েছিল। এই কথাটা আমি আজ পর্যন্ত কারোর সাথে শেয়ার করিনি, কিন্তু যেহেতু আজকে ডমিনেটিং এর ব্যাপারটা আপনি জানতে চাইলেন তাই বলছি যে আমাকে বের করে দেওয়া হয়েছিল। বাট বাই গড গ্রেস আমার হাজবেন্ড একজন খুব ভালো মানুষ। তিনি সেই দিন যদি আমার পাশে না দাঁড়াতেন তাহলে হয়তো আজকে আদ্রিক এই জায়গায় থাকতো না, বা আমি আদ্রিককে নিয়ে এতটা এগোতে পারতাম না। কিন্তু এটা সব মহিলাদেরই হয়তো ফেস করতে হয় যখন তার পরিবার জানতে পারে যে তার জন্ম দেওয়া বাচ্চাটি একজন স্পেশাল বাচ্চা। কিন্তু তারা পাশে দাঁড়ানোর থেকে আমার মনে হয় সেই মেয়েটিকে আরো বেশি একটা আহ, মানে নরকের দিকে ঠেলে দেয়।
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing, Mrs. Khan. Uh, Ritu Khanna, would you like to share?
मैम, रोहित को लेकर के मेरे जीवन में मैंने डोमिनेंस के ऊपर में मेरे साथ ऐसा कुछ नहीं हुआ, लेकिन हाँ उसके लिए मैंने थोड़ा बहुत हमको जो सुनना पड़ा बचपन में कि हाँ वो ऐसा है, वो बाहरी लोगों से, तो वो ऐसा कोई डोमिनेंस मेरे साथ नहीं हुआ, तो इस विषय में नहीं बोलना चाहती कुछ भी मैं मैम।
Okay, okay. पर रितु दी, इफ यू आप अगर अगर कोई आपसे पूछे कि रोहित के बाद आपको आई मीन रोहित के जन्म से पहले आप एज एन इंडिविजुअल जैसे थी, उसके बाद जो चेंजेस आया लाइफ में,
हाँ
वो चेंजेस कैसा था?
हाँ मैम, शादी से पहले तो लाइफ अलग थी, जो हर लड़की का सपना होता है कि जाऊंगी तो ससुराल में ये होगा, ऐसा होगा, वो होगा। लेकिन रोहित का जन्म मेरे शादी के 1 साल बाद ही हो गया, और जब तक मेरे को ये समझ में आया कि रोहित ऐसा है, लाइफ नॉर्मल ही थी। जैसा ऐसे मैंने कुछ भी अलग नहीं था कि और किसी से मैं कंपेयर करूं तो कि मैं कुछ सफर की, नॉर्मल ही लाइफ थी। लेकिन रोहित के होने के बाद जब 3 साल बाद मुझको लगा कि मैंने उसमें बहन से कुछ डिफरेंस है, तब मुझे लगा कि मेरी लाइफ थोड़ी अलग होने लगी है, क्योंकि मुझे बहुत कुछ संभालना पड़ा, बहुत कुछ अलग समझना पड़ा। लाइफ पूरी टोटल चेंज हो गई। बस यही, वैसे तो जिंदगी में और कोई ऐसा नॉर्मल बिहेवियर ही था सबका, ऐसा कुछ अलग सा मुझको मिला नहीं। और फैमिली में मेरे हस्बैंड के अलावा बाहर का ससुराल का कोई था नहीं कि मुझको कुछ ऐसा अलग सा फेस करना पड़ता, हस्बैंड ही सब कुछ थे। तो ऐसा कुछ अलग सा एक्सपीरियंस मेरी लाइफ में नहीं हुआ मैम।
थैंक यू फॉर शेयरिंग रितु दी, थैंक यू। So as we can understand, in case of disability, when a child is born with when a child is identified as a special needs child, the dominant discourse that follows through is the identity of being a parent of a special needs child. The question that we very often ask ourselves as mothers, that why me? Why मेरे घर में ही ऐसा बच्चा क्यों आया? Many of the parents ask these questions to themselves, and a journey which is very difficult in the in the social structure that we are in, that starts from there. Dealing with the immediate family, dealing with the challenges of the child, not understanding the challenges of the child, not understanding ourselves, at the same time dealing with the society at large. So it gives us an identity of a person, of a mother or a parent who is constantly fighting for the child, for the well-being of the child, for the welfare of the child, for the right of the person, for the right of themselves. And in the process, somehow, the same mother or the same father who happened to be maybe a good singer, who happened to be like life a lot, who happened to enjoy movies, who happened to be with, happened to love being with people, happened to be a teacher, those identities starts fading out. And this single story of being a parent of an autistic child, it starts to dominate the person's identity as a whole. So the whole narrative approach or narrative way of life, it seeks to be a very respectful process and a non-blaming approach, and it's mostly used for one-on-one counseling or for community work. It's very effective for community work, which assumes that people, all of us as individuals, we are the experts of our own lives. the different stories that we carry, we have the power, we have the agency to choose among those stories. And it's only a matter of choice, and it's only a matter of bringing it into the focus of, I mean, the different stories into the focus and finding the positive ways of life. So another thing, so the first thing that is in narrative approach is very important is the essence of the stories of our individual lives. And the second thing that narrative focuses on and it talks about, it separates the individuals from the problems. So if I am a person with a chronic medical illness, then I am not the illness. I'm the person and I'm suffering. The problem is the illness. I am not the problem. So in narrative approach, it views people and problems separately. And it assumes that people do have many skills, their beliefs, their values, their commitments, abilities, competencies, and that those strengths can actually help them to reduce the influence of the problems in their lives. So if I'm a survivor or a person with a chronic illness, I also have a lot of other areas in my life. Maybe I have a workplace. Maybe I have different interests of life. Maybe I have a wonderful friend circle. Maybe I have some interests in life that from where I can derive strength to deal with the problem, which is the chronic illness in my life. So me, Amrita Panda, is not equal to chronic illness. Chronic illness is the problem in Amrita's life. And these two individuals, narrative teaches us to separate the individual from the problem, to separate the identity of carrying a problem from the individual. So it focuses on the fact that the problem is just a part of our lives. It can be a very major part, but there are also other ways, other areas, other beliefs, other strengths, other values in our life that can bring in a lot of strengths. And it focuses on those strengths rather than the problems. Next slide, Priyanka. So as I said that this is the narrative approach is a comparatively very new approach of therapeutic modalities in today's world. And it was first developed by therapists Michael White and David Epstein, who were based out of New Zealand in the year 1980. And since then, narrative therapy has become a modality of interest of psychologists, and it offer counseling, as I said, in a very non-judgmental and non-pathological approach. It doesn't want to label. It doesn't want to identify a person with a problem. It rather wants to seek, it rather wants to focus on the strength area of the person. Instead of focusing on the problem, it rather wants to focus on the other strengths of the individuals. And when focusing on a problem, it tries to deconstruct that problem, break the problem into pieces, and understand how the problem really looks like. And in narrative approach, narrative is a very creative approach, and it focuses more on emotions. It focuses on beyond the stories, it focuses more on the impact of those stories and how those stories shape up our life. Next slide. So as I mentioned already, the core aspects of narrative therapy is first the deconstruction of the problem, breaking down the problem into steps, into components, smaller components, and identifying the dominant storylines or narratives. Which are the storylines? If I have, say, different experiences of my life, if I tell myself a story of if I consider myself as not a good mother, if I consider myself as not a woman enough, if I consider myself, also consider myself as a good therapist, if I consider myself as a good teacher, if I consider myself as a good friend. So it tries to find out these different storylines. So if I consider myself as a good friend, then I have a story, I have an experience, I have a sequence of events before forming this kind of identity. If I feel that I am a good friend, I'm a good friend to someone or to multiple people, then I have several experiences around friendship that has developed this feeling inside me. So the narrative approach tries to deconstruct these discourses and tries to find out the storylines, the dominant storylines and narratives that governs our life. And of course, breaking the narrative into smaller and more manageable chunks. So when I say that uh, I'm a good friend, I believe I'm a good friend. So the first question, the first thing that will come after this is that what makes me feel that I am a good friend? What makes me a good friend to others? So breaking it down into smaller and more manageable, tangible chunks, step by step. Then comes rewriting the script of the problematic and dominant stories. If there are problematic storylines that are dominating our lives, then rewriting the script, not the positive ones, but of the problematic dominant storylines. If I feel that I'm a struggling mother of a special need child, so this is a belief that I have about myself, and I have a story to support this belief. So we tend to break it down into smaller pieces, smaller chunks, and try to rewrite the script. What makes me a struggling mother of a special child? What does the struggle look like? So what are the strengths, that what are the resources that I have that can support me to deal with such challenges? And we rewrite the script once again, over and over again, through different such problematic discourses. And at the same time, broadening our view and moving toward healthier storylines, as I said. So this is primarily a basic idea of the core aspects of narrative therapy. Can we move to the next slide? Yes. And it's also very important to remember that what is true to one person might not be true for another person. So what is a similar situation can give different people different experience. If we go through, when we go through a challenge, some people conceive it as I said at the beginning, some people perceive it as a source of strength. Some people breaks down, some people stays in the middle, and the experience, if there is a single situation and three people are experiencing it, and we later on we ask them about their experience, the three experiences are likely to be very different from each other, and the impact these three people carries in their future life can also be very, very different. So truth is something very it depends on the individual's experience. So what is true to one person might not be true to another person, because the way they look at that situation. And of course, as I mentioned, externalizing the problem from the individual, because you are not the problem. The problem is a situation, differentiating individual and challenges, the externalization process, and building finally a healthy narrative which adds more meaning and adds more purpose, more healthy purpose in our life. So these are the core aspects of narrative therapy. So yes, we will move to a video from here. Priyanka, if you can play it. And make it full screen.
When you hear the words "once upon a time." For me, I feel a bit of nostalgia and anticipation that a really good story is coming. It evokes memories of being transported to faraway, magical lands where heroes and villains exist, where there are fairy godmothers, maybe glass slippers and pumpkins. You know what I mean. There's something so powerful about the way that a good story can transport us and ignite our imagination, maybe even filling us with a sense of wonder and hope. A good storyteller has the power to create a really enriching experience for their listeners. The truth is, though, that we are all storytellers, each and every one of us, whether we realize it or not. We're constantly telling ourselves stories about who we are, labeling the experiences that we go through, the interactions we have with others, our challenges, our achievements. And sometimes the way that we tell the stories about the things that are happening in our lives or about ourselves can be really helpful and useful to us and propel us forward. Other times, however, they can really be pretty disempowering and keep us stuck in a negative feedback loop. Narrative therapy is a really useful approach to becoming aware of the stories that we hold and that we have accepted as true, and reflecting on what happens to us or for us when we believe that story. It helps us play with rescripting these stories or finding a different version that might be more useful or more helpful for our present day selves. We're so used to thinking of our perceptions as objective reality, but so many of our beliefs about ourselves and the world are based on the meaning that we assign to it. I'm sure it has happened to you that you have been to an event or gone through something with a colleague or a friend, a family member. You both observe or participate in the same exact thing, and you walk out having totally different experiences. Who's right? Is the dancer on the New York City subway a nuisance getting in the way of you reading your book peacefully? Or is it a magical New York City moment that's adding excitement to an otherwise dull ride? That example is pretty personal since I live in the city and have definitely told myself both of those stories and others about the performers that come on board. Take, for example, a child with a wild imagination who, because they're so busy in their mind, thinking of new ideas and crafting stories, might be bumping into things a lot, forgetful, they might struggle with organization. Now, one parent might look at this child and say, "You're so spacey and all over the place. You're really going to have a challenging time functioning as an adult in the real world." Another parent might look at the same child and say, "Wow, I love watching the wheels turning in your brain. I can't wait to see what you are going to create with that mind of yours." Which parent's right? Neither? Both? Each parent is taking in certain objective behaviors and then making meaning of it as it relates to the present and to the future of their child. And if the child hears either message enough, they will likely adopt it as their own. And that can really influence their trajectory in life, right? A child who carries their imagination as a blessing versus a burden. I know which one I'd rather be. Let's experiment with this, because we all have these types of stories about ourselves, whether they might have been created or reinforced by our parents, our siblings, friends, strangers, teachers. It really could be anyone. Some of these personal narratives of ours might be ones that we want to hang on to and strengthen because they might be really useful to us. Others, though, might be ready to say goodbye and be evolved into a newer, more helpful version. So let's see. I invite you to think of a personal quality of yours that you have come to think of as negative, or others have told you is negative. Maybe it's that you're too quiet, or that you're too loud, you're always late, you're too perfectionistic. The list goes on. As you settle on one, you might recall stories from childhood or more recently where this trait was really put on display, and it got reinforced for you that it's pretty negative. When you have the trait and you have a story or two, I invite you to grab a piece of paper and a pen and jot this down. Write about this trait, why it's negative, how you know that it's negative, and jotting down the stories that confirm it as such. When you're done, you have two options. The first is to find the exception to the rule. So, finding an example of a time where you displayed the opposite trait of that negative quality. So if you're the one who is considered to be super quiet, maybe finding an example, however small, of a time where you weren't that quiet, where you were either loud or just like everyone else. And write about that in great detail. Write about what helped you exercise the opposite trait, how you can see yourself doing it again in the future, what conditions might support that for you. Another option, you can choose to turn around the negativity of this trait and write all the ways that it's actually pretty positive and it might serve you or others. I know this might be challenging, but stretch yourself. When you're done, read over both narratives, the original negative story and your second rescripted version. So either the exception to the rule or the turnaround, finding the positive in it. And notice your internal reaction and response as you read each one. Which one feels more true? You might feel a lot more comfortable to read the first in some way because it might just be more familiar. That's super normal. But I'd like you to consider, as you read your second, what if this weren't true? What if I choose to see it this way? What might that create for me in my life? You can take this technique on the road with you, noticing when you're replaying an old narrative and you're caught in a loop. Take a pause, take a breath, and tell yourself a different story.
Yes. So I believe that the video that we just watched, I'm happy that it had got subtitles as well, so that you could actually understand if you miss on the accent. So as the video mentioned, that in a situation, in a particular scenario, the way we look at the situation can be very different for different people, and it might not be, and there might not be any right or wrong. It can just be different and meaningful from an individual perspective to each of the individuals who are observing it. So now I would like to move towards, we have talked about single story, and I would like to show you a TED Talk, which is a very famous TED Talk of somebody called Chimamanda from Nigeria. And Priyanka, it's on the 17th slide. And it's called The Danger of a Single Story. And I would really like you to listen to it, to read the subtitles that will be shown on the screen, and try to understand the way she is trying to explain the danger of a single story, being a woman from Africa.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again.
Thank you, Priyanka. So I would like to invite any of you, if you want to unmute and talk about how this particular video resonated, or what do you, if you have any thoughts or anything to share or anything that resonates with your personal experience. Like to share?
I have a question, Amrita. I was thinking about it. May I?
Yeah, please, yeah, go.
So when we are talking about thinking about other perspectives or narratives, is there inherently an element of not taking accountability to change? Naki, it just appears to me as I am, looking at it from a privileged perspective. And how do you see it? If I'm practicing or going into narratives.
Can you please come again with the question? I really didn't get it.
Yes. So I meant to ask you, Dharo, I have a behavior which I kind of identify as a negative or unhelpful behavior. But in the practice of narrative therapy, approach, if I start to see it differently and as an empowering one, do you think that for some people there might be a area of not taking responsibility for their behavior or not taking accountability for their behavior? এটা কি হতে পারে?
No, I don't feel the same, because the moment you are identifying something as contributing negatively in your journey, you are being accountable to it. And you are identifying it, and you are trying to understand the journey that made this particular discourse negative in your life, and the stories that you have told yourself or you have picked up from the dominant discourses of the society to frame this particular story. And that way, that's the first step of accountability to the negativity. And it's not just, I mean, ignoring the negativity and walking towards a positive discourse. It's more about understanding the dynamics that that was the process. I mean, the process that has given birth to this negative discourse,
Right, right.
and making it, I mean, breaking it down in smaller chunks, trying to understand the all the times it has the all the times you have experienced something that has contributed to this particular storyline and this particular negative belief.
Right.
So the very first step is accountability towards the negativity.
And thank you for reframing it, Karan. I was also thinking about this narrative that I had in my head that being fat is not okay. And when I was hearing to that story, and when I hear you speak about it after that, যখন I realized, so basically we only see like skinny people on screen being leads. And when it's difficult for me to find the 36 wasted genes for me, I automatically felt very abnormal and out of the matrix. So maybe it's like acknowledging that feeling, okay, so I'm also normal. It's just part of the system.
So it's not about whether being fat is okay or not okay. It's the question will be, how is being fat contributing negatively in your life? And if it is contributing negatively, which are the moments that has contributed to this negativity? What were the experiences? And then going through those experiences and trying to come up with a more positive approach that can actually serve you. I mean, the fact that I am fat cannot be changed. But how, if it is impacting my life on a negative way, how I can go deeper and understand why is it negative at all in my life, and then working on that particular approach.
So it's just like the social model of disability, right? Where we say that disability itself is not the issue, but the social system.
It's absolutely same when we say that the individual is not the problem is the problem.
Right.
Most of the times we kind of merge the individual and the problem to be a single entity. We become the problem. But a distancing problem with the individual gives a lot of space to think about the problem and the journey of that problem.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
So,
ম্যাম,
I
আমি
think,
একটা কথা জিজ্ঞেস করতে চাইছি। আমি
please.
জানি না এটা রিলেটেড অর নন রিলেটেড। যেরকম আপনি বললেন যে এই যে নেগেটিভ ইম্প্যাক্টটা যে পড়ছে সমাজের তরফ থেকে, সেটা আমার ক্ষেত্রে বেশি হয় কারণ আমি একজন নিজে খুব মানে খুবই ইমোশনাল, ওভার ইমোশনাল পার্সন বলতে পারেন। ছোট থেকে ছোট জিনিস আমার চোখ থেকে জল বার করে দেয়। তো সেই ক্ষেত্রে কি ফেস করি আমি, এই কন্টিনিউ এটা হতে 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 আমি এখন এটা বিলিভ করতে শুরু করেছি। আমি বুঝতে পারি হয়তো এই জিনিসটা বিলিভ করা উচিত নয় যে আমি খুব খারাপ একজন মানুষ, আমি কারোর সাথে আমি সেইভাবে রিলেট করতে পারি না, তাই হয়তো আমার অপোজিট পার্সন যে দাঁড়িয়ে আছে আমার সামনে, সেও আমার সাথে রিলেট করতে পারছে না। তো এই যে আমার থিঙ্কিংটা, এটা আমি কিন্তু বুঝতে পারছি হয়তো এটা রং থিঙ্কিং, কিন্তু এটা বারবার আমাকে এটা ভাবতে বাধ্য করছে। যেটা আপনি বললেন না যে শুধুমাত্র যে ওটা ফিল করছে শুধু তারই দোষ নয়, অপরজন যে আছে তারও কিছু না কিছু একটা ইম্প্যাক্ট আছে, যার জন্য আমি ওই জিনিসটা ভাবতে বাধ্য হচ্ছি যে হ্যাঁ, আমি হয়তো খুব বাজে একজন মানুষ। তো এইটাকে কিভাবে আমি মানে এটা থেকে কিভাবে বেরিয়ে যাব?
তো
কারণ এটা
শম্পা,
খুব
এই যে
বেশি আমাকে হার্স করছে, মানে আমার অনেক কিছুই এটাতে এটার উপর ডিপেন্ডেন্ট হয়ে পড়ছি আমি যে হ্যাঁ আমি বাজে মানুষ। তার জন্য আমি নিজেকে একটা দেয়াল তৈরি করে দিচ্ছি যাতে আমি অন্য কারোর সাথে কোনো রকম যোগাযোগ না রাখতে পারি। ইভেন কি আমি দুদিন আগে নিজেকে এরকম তৈরি করেছিলাম, আমি আমার সমস্ত ফোন সুইচ অফ করে দিয়েছিলাম, দরজার ডোরবেল বন্ধ করে দিয়েছিলাম, যাতে আমি নিজের মাথাটা একটু কাম ডাউন করতে পারি বা নিজেকে এটা ভাবানোর জায়গায় নিয়ে আসতে পারি যে অ্যাজ আ হিউম্যান বিং আমি অতটাও খারাপ নয়, হয়তো কিছু গুড কোয়ালিটিও আমার মধ্যে আছে। তো এইটা না আমি কিছুতেই নিজের থেকে বের হতে পারছি না ম্যাম।
হ্যাঁ, এটা নিয়ে আমাদের নিশ্চয়ই আমাদের একটা লম্বা কাজ করতে হবে শম্পা। এই যে কথাটা আপনি বললেন যে আপনি বিশ্বাস করছেন যে এই যে একটা একটা স্টোরি, একটা বিলিফ আপনার, তো আমার মনে হয় আপনি যা বললেন আমি যদি ঠিক বুঝে থাকি, তাহলে আপনি বলতে চাইছেন যে এই যে বিশ্বাসটা আপনার যে আপনি খুব ভালো নন, এটা আপনাকে যন্ত্রণা দিচ্ছে, তাই তো?
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম, মানে
হ্যাঁ,
খুবই যন্ত্রণা দিচ্ছে আমার। ইভেন
যন্ত্রণা
কি আমি
দিচ্ছে।
রাতে ঘুম থেকে উঠেও আমার হাজবেন্ডকে ডেকে বলছি আমি কি এতটাই বাজে মানুষ, মানে ও একটু মানে অবাক হচ্ছে যে আমি কেন এগুলো বলছি, এবং আমি নিজে নিজেই হয়তো রিপিট করছি। আমি ধরুন আমার কারোর সাথে নতুন আলাপ হলো, আমি তার সাথে দুটো কথা বলে তিনটে কথা বলার আগে নিজেকে স্টপ করে দিচ্ছি, না না আমি আর এগোবো না, আমি তো খারাপ মানুষ, ওর সাথে আমার হয়তো ঝগড়া হতে পারে।
তো
খুবই
শম্পা,
যন্ত্রণা
আপনার
দিচ্ছে।
এই যে বিলিফটা, দিস হ্যাজ বিকাম ইয়োর ডমিনেন্ট স্টোরি। হ্যাঁ, এবং এই বিলিফটা তো একদিনে হয়নি, ইট হ্যাজ টেকেন
না।
আ লং টাইম।
হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ,
এবং
হ্যাঁ।
it has got a lot of other experiences that shaped up this belief.
হুম, হুম।
So if we work together, we will first focus on the experiences that has given you these beliefs, this particular belief, and
আচ্ছা।
we will try to see that what are the other beliefs that you have about yourself, which can be more empowering, and how we can replace those positive, more empowering beliefs to deal with this negative belief that is ruling you at this moment. হ্যাঁ,
আচ্ছা,
তো আমরা নিশ্চয়ই এটা একটা থেরাপি সেশনে বসে কাজ করতে পারি।
ওকে ম্যাম। আমি কি তাহলে অ্যাপয়েন্টমেন্ট নেব আপনার বা মধুপর্ণা ম্যামের?
হ্যাঁ, অবশ্যই।
ঠিক আছে ম্যাম, থ্যাংক ইউ।
থ্যাংক ইউ শম্পা শেয়ার করার জন্য। প্রিয়াঙ্কা, আমাদের কত টাইম কি আছে? আচ্ছা, আমি জাস্ট আর 5 মিনিট টাইম নেব। একটু যদি এটা শেয়ার করিস পিপিটিটা। সো আমরা so there are different techniques used in narrative approach, and these techniques are used. The basic purpose is like the way I just mentioned, to find out the journey of that negative belief and to replace it with something more empowering. So there are certain processes that a narrative therapist follows or uses. A very important one is externalization, where we uh, try to observe ourselves as an outsider, externalizing the problem from the individual and try to observe ourselves. So this is called the externalization process. This is something, I mean, this is a very short time to talk about narrative. And I believe narrative is something which cannot be, I mean, it's very difficult to do justice to narrative approach unless it's a very, very long time. So this webinar is just about a brief idea about narrative, and externalization being one of the very important process, a primary process of narrative approach. Next slide, Priyanka. The next step, another approach is the deconstruction, where we gain clarity in the stories. We try to break the story into pieces, into small chunks, and we try to see the different nuances of the story and how the story has existed for a very long time, how the story was formed, how we have what was the dynamic of the story like, and the way the story gradually gradually got connected to each other and formed a more powerful version of the belief that we started with. So deconstruction is another process where we go step by step to understand the story, to understand the discourse of a particular problem. Next, Priyanka. So unique outcomes are, it's more like it's a strategy which comes when we deconstruct a story, when we externalize, when we try to see the dynamics of it, and we reach a state which is comparatively, which is a positive approach towards the problem, and we call it unique outcomes. So the negativities go out of the window, and we tend to be empowered with a stronger version of the story, and that improves the quality of life for us. Next slide, Priyanka. Yeah. So I'm sure that we have covered a very small aspect of narrative therapy today. And I tried to give you a very brief and sketchy generalized idea about narrative therapy. Priyanka, over to you. I think you have things to share with the people, with the participants, so that
Yes.
they can have better understanding of narrative therapy.
Sure, sure. So before we go to the last section of it, we have also shared a feedback form with you all, and we would request you to fill up that যাতে আমরা আপনাদের সাথে reach out করতে পারি, and we can issue the e-certificate for all of you. And with that feedback form, we are also allowing you, or we are sending you another form in the chat box here that would allow you to understand narrative approach in a more dense and a more elaborate way. And we're launching a workshop on the same Rethinking the Script of Disability, a Narrative Toolkit. So today was an introduction where we talked about the concepts in general, and we did not go a lot into personal experiences that can form that and how we can work around it. So we have an expert with us. We have Miss Yashna Vishwanathan. She's a very experienced narrative practitioner. Anybody who has heard of narrative in India has heard of her. So she is one of the founder members in the in India for the practice of narrative in general. So we would have her with us on 30th and 31st of August. We would possibly be having a workshop of 5 to 6 hours, along with a lot of activities and exploration of our thoughts and experiences in general. So for the participants here today, we have a special offer, and the form is there to fill up in the chat box. So we are offering that to you in the early bird special offer in 1800, and later we would increase the price at 200 to 2200. But till tomorrow, and for the participants here specifically, we have the special offer. And in this, we would go around understanding how we understand disability as one single story, how we can navigate around it as professionals, as parents, and as individuals with special needs. So this is open to everybody who's related or not related to the field. If you want to explore a new dimension of therapeutic approach, if you want to understand how people are becoming more and more neurodivergent, inclusive practitioner, this can be your go-to therapy workshop to begin with. And of course, if you like it, we can even come up with more specific, detailed training courses. But this would be almost the second round of it, where we would have a long discussion, and we would have Yashna with us to, help us take away certain things more intensely. So I hope that you can see that link there. It would be an online session, yes, and we would reach out to all of you again, no worries, but we would request you to fill up the form at the earliest, because the seats are really limited. It's going to be a very small size batch, and I would hope to see all of you in that as well. So the timing is 11 a.m. tomorrow, and then we close the early bird offer, and we would launch a real offer, that creative will go out in public, but this offer is only for you all who are here. So, ma'am, I think we are going to close today here with the announcement. And thanks a lot to you for your time and effort, and for always keeping on learning new things so that we can learn more. And I would also like to thank our backend team. Alice has wonderfully done the PPT. Tulada has been there constantly managing the Zoom application. And we have everybody in the office with us throughout the process. So thank you so much. We'll see you around. We are planning and launching again a series of webinars. So in August we had this, and then September, October till December we have plans. We'll come up with all of it and keep in touch with you. So thank you, everybody. Good evening. Have a nice time. Thank you, ma'am.